Welcome to the Bywords Show. I'm your host, Hannah Hughes. Bywords is all about equipping women for purposeful living by starting conversations, celebrating stories, and inspiring faith. In a world that applauds the hustle, I'm here to help you break free from the lies and come back to what really matters. It's time to get real, get rooted in truth, and come alive in relationship with Jesus so you can show up to each day with intention and confidence no matter where you're at in your story. Here we believe that embracing our stories brings hope, healing, and purpose to the process, and sharing our stories helps others do the same. Whether you're looking for a midweek faith refresh, practical tools for pursuing your dreams, or just need some good old-fashioned girl talk, you're in the right place. Grab your latte and let's dive in. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Bywords Show. Today's the day. So glad you guys are here. We are in for a treat. We've got Bettison with us here today. And you guys, I'm just so excited that she's here because this is something we've not talked about on the show before. This whole behind the scenes, peeling back the filter of what it's actually like to be a missionary, living on the mission field. And I've shared a little bit about my own experiences on the show before, but Karen has written a book and shares about her experiences. So I'm just so excited for you guys to get to hear from her. And as we're getting started, Karen, would you just quickly introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay, sure. Right now, I'm a nurse working in the St. Louis area. I served as a missionary with Pioneer Bible Translators for 19 years in West Africa. I served with the organization for about 25 years total, but 19 years I was assigned first as a single missionary and then my husband and I as a couple to the field of West Africa. And I always dreamed of being a missionary. So growing up, I, kind of kept that in my sights. I went to Bible college, then studied to be a Bible translator and a nurse, and then went to field.
Wow. So, what was it that initially led you to the mission field, and what was your experience like during those 25 years?
Well, I can point to a period when I was 11 years old. It was a summer, and we had some visiting missionaries come from different countries. One was from India. I remember him, and his sermon was so compelling. And just that message to reach the lost. And, the fact that as Christians, we are all called to fulfill the Great Commission. And it sounded so fascinating what he was doing. And then another missionary came from Africa and spoke that summer. And I just felt like, wow, this is so intriguing. And then I went to church camp that same summer. More missionaries were from Africa serving there that week, and I got to know them more closely and talk with them about it. And they just really encouraged me to consider it as a career, or I mean, you don't normally think of it as a career, but as a calling, as a pursuit, something that you do. And I kept that in the back of my mind, and I, kind of got a little distracted during my teen years, but came right back to that. Went to Bible college and just was on fire, part of the missions program. Of course, in those early years, there's, a lot of idealism. I'm sure you can relate
Yeah.
to that. You hear these motivational speakers and you think you can do anything, and then hear the great victory stories. We hear a lot about victory stories from missionaries. All these people came to Christ. We translated the Bible. And so all those things, I kept those in my sights. I want to do something great for God. And so as I, of course, got to the field, there's the nitty gritty. Early on
Mhm.
within my first term, I served a term single. I struggled with loneliness, depression, difficulties like just logistics of trying to make things happen. There was civil unrest. There were times when I was sick or I was dealing with, you know, people coming to my door and dying, children dying, just all the hard things just kind of hit you head on. And then
Yeah.
there's conflicts with other missionaries. That's a real common scenario that plays out on the mission field. Just trying to work together as a team, the difficulties in doing that. So there's so many layers and layers of stresses and culture shock, just adjusting to another culture. For
Yeah.
me, as time went on, I was in a place in West Africa that was pretty rough. There was a war going on in that region. It kept spilling over into the areas where I worked, or we would feel the effects of it. There would be young soldier young men who were soldiers, and when the war was over, they didn't know what else to do, so they had their guns still, so they would come and rob Americans or foreigners, and so there's a
Mm.
lot of that kind of thing going on in that region, so it's very unpredictable, and so as those traumas began impacting my life and the lives of my colleagues, you know, you start building traumatic experiences. And, you have your own
Yeah.
experiences, and then you have secondary trauma by experiencing that through your colleagues and your friends, even Africans or nationals in whatever country you're living, the crises they go through. And so it becomes compounded. And so for me,
Yeah.
I really didn't see it coming back in the early 90s. They didn't really call it PTSD, or they started calling it PTSD, but it wasn't talked about. And of course,
Mm.
there wasn't a lot of help for missionaries back then in terms of really good trauma counseling. There was still kind of an old school thought of, you're a missionary, you're super spiritual, you can handle anything. And
Yeah.
so, that kind of impacted me because I didn't process that trauma early on very well. And I stuffed it and I tried to give the appearance that I was doing okay when deep down inside I wasn't. And so then over time, that PTSD got more severe. The more traumas, the more layer of traumas happened. And so that was my experience. Of course, there were some great things that happened. We had newsletters we sent home and told about all the victories, oh, we had this great opportunity to go share scripture in this village, or we had a medical clinic and all these people were helped. And maybe every once in a while there would be somebody that came to Christ. We always told those stories in our newsletters and asked for prayer for some of the challenges, but never felt like we could really tell the nitty gritty of what was going on behind the scenes sometimes. And so I think that, was my experience in general. Of course, we raised after my husband and I were married, we went to the field together and started a translation project we picked up a project that someone else had started and we were able to bring that into more advanced phase. We got the New Testament completed and published. We got several books of the Old Testament published. We were able to rough draft the whole Old Testament into the language in which we worked, developed literacy primers, lots of other materials for people to read. So we did a lot of tangible things. And there were some converts, and we worked with other missionaries, had great fellowship with other missionaries. Our kids had an amazing life growing up. They didn't really see the trauma so much. I think we sheltered them to some degree. We didn't let them see all the bad things. They played with their African friends or their missionary friends and they swang on vines. They had a tree house. They had, just the fun things of childhood. And we homeschooled them. So that, of course, was an added challenge. I think logistically in Africa, there were some hard things to deal with that we had to constant eruptions, like the power would go out, the well with the pump was broken, we wouldn't have water. So those basic
Mm.
things that we take for granted here in the United States that are just there, or you call a repairman to fix and
Yeah.
they're fixed in a few hours, were very labor intensive for us, and we had to learn how to do those things ourselves. My husband had to rewire our house probably twice to get everything to work. And he had to
Wow.
become an electrician because he did, you just couldn't hire somebody quality to come and do that. So there were a lot of things like that that were just really hard daily grind stuff. Of course, we had to make all our food
Mm.
from scratch. There was very little packaged foods that you could just go, and we didn't have a microwave, so everything's cooked the old-fashioned way, and when there were fuel shortages, gas shortages, we couldn't use our gas stove. We actually cooked on an open fire sometimes when things got bad,
Wow.
but most of the time we had amenities, we just had to work hard for them, so that was what life was like.
Wow. It's wild hearing the stories because I remember growing up and having missionaries come to our church and sharing those same kinds of experiences, sharing the wins and sharing how beautiful it was to see God move in these different countries. And it was so inspiring. And then similarly, I grew up and ended up having some missions experiences through college and afterwards through YWAM. If you guys are familiar with Youth with a Mission, I did some short-term missions, but man, for 25 years, like that's some commitment to what God was calling you to in the mission field. And I think it's so interesting when people talk about or think about missions, because I think a lot of people do have the rose colored glasses and think about like going out somewhere and showing the Jesus film and everybody's just dancing and praising. And we forget sometimes that we have kind of like made the life on mission. We've kind of like morphed it into this American dream or like confused the two and forgotten that actually living on mission and being missionaries going into the mission field requires sacrifice. It requires getting out of your comfort zone entirely. And it requires getting into the nitty gritty, like you said, with people. It's not just like having a nice conversation with someone and leading them to Christ. It's like you're living with people and you see the good, bad, and ugly. I mean, 25 years worth. My husband's parents actually were missionaries in Asia. So he grew up overseas and they did a lot of the same things. His dad was translating Bibles and they were living in villages. And it's just such a different experience than what I
Mhm.
had an understanding of when I was growing up in the church world. So, hearing you talk about the hard parts too, and especially how there wasn't much talk or resources or help for missionaries going through trauma, PTSD, those kinds of things in the beginning. I mean, what was that like for you in those hard times hold on to your faith? Were there ever moments where you doubted God and the call that he had for you guys to be missionaries?
Oh, certainly. My first term, near the end of my first term, I really struggled with loneliness. I was single and I
Mm,
knew that this is what I wanted to do, but it had been a really hard 3 years. And I was alone a lot of the time. Even though I was with other colleagues, I felt that loneliness. I was, with the end of my first term, I was 29. And so, the clock was ticking. I wanted to be married and there wasn't anybody in sight. And it's like, Lord, do you want me to continue here single? Or, so I prayed desperately that He would provide for me someone to serve with, a
mm.
husband, preferably. And so I prayed desperately for that. And I prayed for years for that, but it really got intense near the end of my first term because I faced the whole prospect of, okay, I'm going back to the States for a short period of time. I'm going to be coming back. What do I do? And so God was incredibly gracious to me in providing me a husband on that furlough. I met him within a day of coming home. And,
Wow.
like 2 weeks later, really got to know him, and then we hit it off. He just so happened to be interested in mission work. It just God had brought him through so much. He wasn't always a believer, and he was in his senior year of Bible college, just really open to what God wanted him to do, was thinking about overseas missions,
Wow.
so just kind of ripe for that calling on his life. And so we started
Yeah.
talking, and then before you know, we were engaged. And I realized at one point that I believed that God had really just called me to be married to Jim, and that if
Mm,
things didn't work out in West Africa, he would find us another place to serve. It didn't really matter where, but I still hoped that everything would go well, that we'd be able to go back to
yeah.
West Africa. So Jim went by himself on a trip and he decided, this is great. I can do this. Met our colleagues, bonded really well with them. And so then
Mm,
got married. He went through the rest of the training and we went back together as a family. And so when we went back, things, of course, I had been single my first term and knew the ropes, knew how to do everything. But by the time we actually got back to the field, we got married. I got pregnant right away. We had Katie a year later
mm.
and then pregnant again, a second child. So we were ready to go back. We had two small kids. One was 2.5 months old. And going back to Africa with two small children
Wow.
was a completely different experience than being single.
I
We were
can't
in
even
for a
imagine.
surprise. Even just traveling on the airplanes and then getting there, trying to sleep through the night and travel on road trips, which were always so awful with the kids. They would cry and scream and throw up,
Mm.
and those things are so hard to do even in the States, but on curvy, windy mountain roads without a gas station at every
Oh,
corner,
yeah.
it was rough. And I remember at one point we said, "Okay, we're staying put. We are not traveling anymore until they're older," because we just couldn't. It was so rough. And then that whole first year
Yeah.
trying to set up our home where, we had no screens on the windows, no furniture. We were sleeping on the floor under a mosquito net. And it took about a year to get that house really comfortable and functioning well
Mm.
and power and all those things. And so living it kind of camping with your kids while you're setting up a
Mhm.
house and you're learning to be a new parent, it was a blur. And I remember
Yeah.
feeling like, what have I done? I've brought my family to this place. And there were so many times I thought, this isn't working. We can't do this. This is, I was very discouraged many times. And I remember thinking, I'm an educated woman that's got all these skills and I've done these great things. I've been a nurse, I've done literacy, I've taught people to read, and I can translate the Bible, and all I do every day is change diapers and cook and clean and fall
Mm.
to bed exhausted. I'm not even learning the language. I felt like I was spinning my wheels. So I think a lot of young missionary moms feel that way. And I know I've shared with a lot of colleagues
Yeah.
my story. They said the same thing. Those early years where the kids are small, it's so hard on the mission field. So you have all the normal things that are hard about being a parent on top of cross cultural, adjustments. So just so many
Gosh.
challenges, but we pushed through. We got through that. Probably by my third term, things were running way smoother. We had our house set up. The kids had a rhythm routine. We were homeschooling. Jim had a routine doing the translation work. I helped out, and things were going really well that third term most of the time. But then, more civil unrest would occur. We had some, colleagues that had to be evacuated in emergencies and things like that
Mm.
constantly happening, bringing stress back into the picture. And there, then the electricity issue would go, it would go out or we would be robbed or, some other thing would happen. And so
Yeah.
it seems like sometimes we couldn't get a break. And so
Yeah.
year after year, we'd have good times and then we'd have really rough times. I remember there was a time when there was a colleague that we were having difficulty with, and I remember feeling at that time, maybe this isn't what we're supposed to do. And so I think
Mm.
it's hard to not let the enemy knows that what you're doing when you're serving the Lord is important. And when you're especially on the front lines of any ministry, being a pastor or being the leader of a ministry, being on the mission field for sure, you're really on the
Yeah.
front lines. And so you should not be surprised that you're going to have enemy gunfire, so to speak. You're going to be attacked. And I think,
Yeah.
looking back, a lot of those doubts and things that came into our minds, a lot of the trauma, a lot of it was spiritual warfare. And, I think we have
Mm.
that anywhere we live. The enemy can just bring doubts into our
Yeah.
minds and tell us we're not, you know, maybe we're not doing the right thing, or maybe we're not good enough, or maybe, I'm unworthy. God hates me. God doesn't love me. I remember one time, probably the most traumatic thing that ever happened to me was in 2006. I was driving along the road after an outing with some friends, and a little girl ran in front of my car. And I tried to avoid her, but I couldn't. And I heard the thud of her body on my
Mm.
car, and I just froze. And we got out and we took her to the hospital, and she didn't make it. And having killed someone, even though it wasn't,
Mm.
something I intended to do, and the whole aftermath of that whole experience, dealing with the government, corrupt government who wanted to take advantage of us, threatened a trial, threatened to put me in jail. It was a very long, hard
Mm,
ordeal. It happens. I'm not the only one. I've heard other stories that were worse than ours where people actually did go to jail for hitting a pedestrian. Um, and
mm,
getting through that was so hard. I know I felt when that happened that God had abandoned me. I I truly
mm,
felt like he was not there. I was in a very dark place. I got very depressed. Thankfully, God brought people into the picture who, just orchestrated all the events so that that situation resolved. But I still lived for years and to this day, with the guilt of that having happened. And I know that, ultimately it was one of the main reasons we did finally come back to the States. The layers of trauma
mm,
and then that on top of all of it. Really, when we met with counselors, they said, you need some time to heal. And thankfully, I feel like I have healed. But,
mm.
PTSD is what it is. And sometimes things are triggered, not just with that trauma, but with other traumas. And so I live with that. But I do
Yeah.
recommend for, missionaries that do go through trauma, get help, get counseling. Don't feel like you have to be super spiritual walking through these things alone. We all are human and we all need help dealing with these kind of things. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I just appreciate you being willing to share your story and just being so honest about your experience because I've talked to other people who serve in the mission field and there's this kind of ideal or expectation, unspoken pressure, to be that spiritual person when you are in a position of spiritual leadership, a missionary, that kind of thing. And it's like, I should be fine. Like God called me to this. I should be like so confident in my call and like those feelings of failure, the feelings of guilt, the feelings of that weight almost where it's like your responsibility to get these people to Christ or to make it all work out perfectly together and sometimes that's just not the case. It's hard. I mean, it's it's working with people, and
Mhm.
that's so unpredictable at times, and there's gonna be trauma, there's gonna be pain, there's gonna be just hard seasons with that, and I just appreciate you being willing to not only share your story, but also encourage other people who are currently missionaries or who have served, because I've just heard other stories and even my own experiences. I had hard experiences in the mission field, I had a different kind of experience, but I did short-term missions in Paris and also in Athens working with refugees, and it's hard, you see and hear things that are uncomfortable, and coming back from that, I mean, I remember just going straight to counseling and just being like, "I have got to process what I just saw and experienced because it is
Yeah.
hard and it's painful to see and experience." And I mean, how was it for you guys when you came back to the States and, you were talking to counselors and realizing, okay, we have been through a trauma and
Mhm.
now we need to be in this healing process?
Well, I something you said there was really, really important. I want to address that is that when, as Americans, I think we're really sheltered from some of these things. You went to this this place where these refugees have been, and I mean, you saw they've been through some really hard things that we as Americans don't understand. And I think as Americans, when
Right.
we see people suffering or when we go through that kind of suffering for the first time, we don't know how to handle it. We're not prepared for that. We kind of go through life with rose-colored glasses, I think, where we're kind of
Yeah.
but we're handed this American dream. This is what
Yeah.
the ideal is, and it is achievable, it is possible, and, we see through movies and television and social media, we get this whole picture of that's what life's about. And I think when we go to the mission field, we're hit between the eyeballs of the reality that life is rough for the vast majority of the world. We are so privileged. But even
Yes.
here in the States, when things don't go right, we struggle. We probably struggle harder than those people there because prepared for it, I think, more than we are. And I think it
Mm.
brings us back and reminds us of the fact that we are in a fallen world. Our world once was Eden. I think that's why we want it. We desire it because we were
Yeah.
made for it. But here we are in a sin cursed world. And that's a reality a lot of us want to ignore. And in our culture, we have so many things that we can do to drown that out and blind us from it. We can wrap ourselves up in sports or Disney or movies or fantasy games, whatever it is. We can drown it all out. And we have all the creature comforts that we're not really uncomfortable most of the time. And when we're sick,
Yep.
the doctors are going to fix it. So we have all these buffers. And that's not life for many people in this world, and it really isn't reality. I talked to someone
Yeah.
recently who said, "We, as Americans, are living in a dream. Like, we're kind of in a dream state. We're not connected with reality all the time." And going to the mission field sure
Mm.
wakes you up and puts you in touch with reality, not just the
Right.
reality of war and illness, but you know, you see that people, even these people that you thought, "Oh, I'm gonna go tell them the gospel and they're all gonna come to Christ." That some of them are good people, but some of them are bad people. Just like here, some people are good people and some people are bad people. There are bad people everywhere. And it's not that
Yeah.
they're bad, but they're fallen. We're all fallen.
Right.
And I think many times on the mission field, you come to terms with your own fallenness because you're not as, great as you thought you were.
Yeah.
There's a lot of literature out there about how marriages are put under so much pressure and put to the test on the mission field. Even the
Mm.
greatest marriages have difficulties because you're just dealing with so many challenges. So, yeah, it's hard. But I don't want to discourage anybody who might be listening from thinking about going and doing,
Right.
something like this, but be prepared and have your eyes wide open and be ready for any eventuality. And sadly, people die on the mission field. I know before modern times, there were missionaries that would go and within 6 months, the whole family was dead. That was the reality.
Mm.
That was the sacrifice that they made. And it's not always that extreme today, but in the many years that I've served as a missionary, I know at least a half a dozen missionaries who lost their lives on the field, and it was
Mm.
because of the illness or, some other tragic event that took place. And so that we are not immune. We are not safe from danger just because we serve the Lord. And I think it's important
Right.
that we remember that God, Jesus called us to take up our cross and follow him. And that's not a pretty cross hanging on your neck like a gold chain. It sometimes is a
Right.
path of suffering. So,
Yeah. That's
I don't know
that's
if I
so
answered
true.
your question completely. Your question,
Oh, no, that's okay. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it's really true. Like, that's very important to note. And my question was when coming back to the States, what was it like for you then going into the healing process? Because you're right. I'm glad you brought that up. For us, we kind of have this, very pretty aesthetic view of our version of reality, but most people in the world, I'm so glad you brought that up. That's not their experience. We're very privileged. And so, you see a lot and you get uncomfortable in the mission field when you experience trauma and then you come back to the States where, the experience is completely different.
yeah.
How did you start to process all of that?
I found it's really funny because, having served overseas for so many years, I had been to 19 different countries, hundreds of airplanes, lived out of suitcases, learned to speak, at least to some degree, 6 different languages. And when we came back, I was done traveling. I was so done.
Mm.
And I remember I got this job, and all these gals were sitting around talking about their next vacation to Mexico. I'm like, "Why would you leave this country?" It was kind of like I was so burned out. But just things like,
Yeah.
you come back and everyone just has this romanticized view of overseas, and it had
Yeah.
lost its romantic allure for me. I was just wanting to be in a safe, calm place, but I didn't feel like I could really that any of those people could understand what I had been through and what my perspective was.
Mm.
And, people were talking about such trivial things in their American lives, and it does give you a different perspective living overseas and then coming here, and you look at what people are concerned about and worried about, and, they say, "Oh, first world problems." It's true. I think
Right.
that's one of the first
Yeah.
things you notice when you come back is, "Why are you worried about that? Be glad you have
Mm.
that or this." So you can kinda go through a cynical phase, a burned out phase when you come back. Um, I, of course, was hurting from a lot of the trauma, and we did get some help, we did get some counseling. The hard thing was that it wasn't always free, and it wasn't always available to our whole family, and so we kind of muddled through it our own way. Eventually, I
Mm.
did go to a trauma counselor who did EMDR therapy, and that really helped me with the trauma part. Our mission
Mhm.
is getting better at providing good counseling for people in what they call reentry. So
Mm.
they're just getting better about everything. So the new missionaries have a much better access to good counseling and good help than we did. And everyone's recognizing, of course, this universal need that missionaries need so much help in times of trauma or transition. But what we did, my husband, he was really wanting to get into getting into ministry. He continued to do the translation remotely for about 3 years from the
Wow.
States. For me, I didn't want to be involved in any kind of ministry. Ministry was where I had been traumatized. And so I needed to step back and get away from that. And that was good for
Mm.
me. But I do think eventually, God started showing me something that blew me away. I didn't expect it at all. I got a job as a nurse so we could pay the bills and have a house, and I had the best source of income, so I did that. But I noticed, it wasn't long before I started seeing that there were patients of mine who had been through some type of trauma. I remember one patient in particular, he was really a ragged type. Long hair, leather jacket, covered in tattoos. He was drunk and he was spitting venom at everybody in the ER, and everybody was like, "Oh man, he's rough, and who wants to go talk to him?" And nobody wanted to be his nurse, and I decided I would be his nurse. And as I was talking to him, I noticed the tattoos, and I asked him about his tattoos, and he told me he got them in Vietnam. And suddenly I
Mm.
realized that I was talking to a traumatized person. And I just
Mm.
started asking him questions and pointed questions. I knew how to get to the heart of his trauma because I had been through trauma. And so as I talked with him, he opened up, he softened, he started telling me what happened, and nobody understood him. I knew how that felt. I knew how it
Yep.
felt to feel trapped and nobody understood what you were going through. And so I talked with him, let him tell his story. And before long, he was cooperative and everything was
Mm.
going better. And I told him, I said, you know, you have hope. Don't ever lose hope. You're probably going to jail for what you did. It looks pretty grim and you're probably very, you know, feeling very hopeless right now. But I want you to know with God, there's always a second chance and he can turn everything
Mm.
around. And so he just kind of looked up at me with tears in his eyes and he said, "Thank you." About a year later, he came into the ER again with his wife this time, and they had been at odds before. Now they were reunited. And he was completely sober and smiling. And he saw me
Wow.
and he recognized me and he said, "What you told me made all the difference, and you were right." And I
Wow.
realized that I had a purpose now that was different. I mean, and really, it was always my purpose, but God used the pain that I went through to give me a new purpose. And that was to be
Mm,
able to see people differently and to touch them and help them with their trauma. I know that that wasn't what I expected. That's not the life that I chose. That is not what I
yeah.
wanted for my life. I didn't want to suddenly, be able to relate to people's trauma because I had been through it. But now I
Right.
saw the power of that. And so ever since then, I cannot tell you the countless number of patients I've been able to help. And not just patients, people. And it gave me a new
Mhm.
perspective. I always thought that my calling and my purpose was to be a missionary on a foreign field. And now that I wasn't anymore, I did struggle for a while with who was I? What is my identity? What am I supposed to do? And all along, I think my purpose never changed. My purpose is what God, I believe, has for all of us. And that is to be disciples, to be faithful. He calls us all to be godly, to be more like Jesus, to salvation. He wants us to be saved,
Mm,
but he also wants us to walk in the fruits of the Spirit. He wants us to share the Great Commission with everybody. And that does not necessarily mean you have to go to a foreign field to do it. And so, no matter where you are, whatever you're doing, that's what he's calling us to do. That is our purpose. But I
mm,
think another layer of that is that whatever we've been brought through, whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, God wants us to be that follower of him in that place. He wants us to shine his light in that place. And if we've come through something difficult, he wants to use that for his glory, for his purpose. So I think when we're talking about what our purpose is, it is really all about aligning ourselves with God's plan, but wherever he puts us. And so, I as a young person and as many young people, they say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I want to be a missionary. Well, I want to be this, I want to be that.
mm.
And we think of that as our purpose. And that's something we do, but our true purpose in Christ is bigger than that. So, God, I don't think is as concerned about what we do is how we do it and who we are in what we do. Does that make sense? So I think it
Absolutely.
frees us up to not feel like, oh, am I doing the right career? Am I doing, are you a mom? Well, yes, that's right now, that's your purpose. The career can wait. The career is not what it's about. When you're 60, you are going to care less about the career you had in your 20s. You're going to look at your kids and
Right.
say, "What did I do wrong with my kids?" So when you have kids, that's what you need to be focusing on. And not that a career is a bad thing, but you know, I remember being in the throes of parenting young children and like, I don't have time to have my quiet time. When am I going to find time to even, read my
Right.
Bible and how can I grow? But God wants to grow us through patience with our children, how to not lose our temper, how to have self-control, how to keep ourselves, in those fruits of the spirit in the moment of those difficulties in raising our kids or whatever other difficulties you're in the middle of. If you're in a really difficult job, you might ask yourself, is this the right job for me? It may or may not be, but what does God want you to do in that difficult job? Does he want you to quit or does he want you may have to quit? But how does he want you to act? Obviously, he doesn't want us to lose our temper. He wants us to show the love of Christ in whatever situation we're in.
Right.
So I think that's a bigger, broader picture of our purpose. And it's not so much a
Mm.
career thing as is a spiritual walk thing.
Yeah. Wow. Man, listening to you tell that story about the guy in the ER just almost brought me to tears because it's like, wow, how how crazy is it? What an unexpected situation,
Yeah.
but just feeling like, "Oh, this is what I was made for." Beyond just being in the mission field in a different country, because I think sometimes it's easy for women especially to get so so wrapped up, like get their identity wrapped up in a position, in a role, in a career,
Yes.
or in a season, in a calling, what they feel God is calling them to do. And then when it's over, it's like, well, what do we have now? Like if seasons change or if your roles shift and
Exactly.
your identity is in that thing, then what do you have left? And it's so beautiful to see how after 25 years in the mission field, you can come back to the States, and also how crazy it is that you're a nurse as well. So, like, you have this understanding of the mind and the body and trauma, and you're able to use your experience now to reach people every day. Like, how
Mhm.
incredible is that that you're living on mission just the same here in the States as you were in Africa. And I just
Mhm.
think that is what we need to be reminded of, like, especially young moms, especially young women who are in the season of, everyone's asking them, oh, what are you going to do with your life? What degree are you going to get? What are you going
Yeah.
to do the next 10 years? What's your 5-year plan? And we can forget that exactly what you said. God is not as concerned about what we're doing as he is with how we're doing it. And are we being faithful to his call for us, which is to him, to serve others, to love others, the Great Commission, exactly what you said.
Yeah.
It's just so easy to miss that when we get
Yeah.
distracted by all the other things that are, important and they matter to us, but we miss the main thing, the most important thing, I
Right.
think, when we get wrapped up in that other stuff, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. And, I
Yeah.
know that's something that a lot of people say, well, I've always wanted to be this or whatever, and they're in school, they're saying, well, it's going to get better down the road when I'm this, when I finish my degree, when I
Mm,
whatever. And we do so much of that kind of thing that we don't live in the moment and look for the opportunities
right.
around us in that moment. And so, yeah, it is such an important thing to to live for every moment and be faithful in that moment.
Right. Absolutely. Well, you touched on something earlier that I want to circle back to real quick before we close. I think it's so important that if someone's listening and they do feel called to the mission field and maybe they're hearing our conversation, they're like, "Ugh, I don't know if I want to do that. Like, that sounds hard. It sounds scary." This conversation is absolutely not to discourage you. I hope that it's encouraging to you listening that God can use everything for good and for his glory and to like continue your path and your purpose. And so I would love to know, Karen, is there anything that you would want to say to somebody who's listening and maybe feels called to missions but is, nervous about what that could mean for them, getting in uncomfortable, getting out of their comfort zone, leaving what they know?
Mhm. Well, again, I would try not to idealize it. Be aware that there are many obstacles. Learn everything you can about missionary trauma. There's some really good resources out there. And I think also, whatever mission organization you decide to go with, make sure they have really good support systems, member care systems in place. It is really not wise, in my opinion, to go out and do something alone. Partnering
Mm.
with an organization that has those resources available is going to be really smart. Those, like I said, most of the bigger organizations are really equipping their members with lots of support systems like that. There's a company, I don't know if it's a company or an organization called Mobile Member Care Team.
Mm.
And I don't know if they're a loose affiliation or what, but we drew on that as a resource many times. They come to your field and they, will respond to a trauma as soon as they can get there. And most of these people they're not just lay counselors from the United States. They're experienced missionaries who've been through
Mm.
trauma, but they also have trauma training, trauma counseling. And so that is a really great resource. Make sure that you have access to that. I do think that it's also something important to get your spiritual life as strong as you can before you go, in
Mm.
terms of just making good daily habits, making sure that you are fully aware that suffering may be a part of your journey. In fact, I wouldn't say maybe, I say will be. I
Yeah.
used to think that suffering or trauma for missionaries was a once in a while thing. And then once I got to the field, it was a question of not if, but when and how often.
Mm.
So be aware that just like if you were enlisting in the military, you're going to be at some point in the line of fire. Be prepared for that. Be realistic about it. If that's something you're not willing to sacrifice, then you should think twice about it. But really, it's just the same with like going into the military. If you don't want to be using a gun, don't go in the military. So if you don't want to be the target of Satan's attacks, then don't go onto the mission field. Don't serve the Lord anywhere because
Yeah.
he can attack you no matter where you're at. So, but if you're family, if you're married, obviously you want to make sure both members of your marriage, husband and wife, are both on board, and your kids too. A lot of families go with kids that are, grade school, teenagers, and those kids don't always want to go. So you got to really make sure everybody's on board because it can cause resentment. Raising missionary children is a whole nother thing. There's a lot of things they go through that are very unique to them. There are resources called third culture kid resources, lots of seminars, camps. They need just as much help as you do. Processing trauma, culture stress, culture change.
Mm,
I know that a lot of missionary kids, they don't really feel like they belong to their home culture, and they don't really feel like they belong to the host culture either. They're kind of stuck in the middle, and that's why they
mm,
call them third culture kids. I know our kids did
mm.
pretty well adjusting back to the States, but coming back, make sure that you have people in your supporting churches who stay in touch with you and your kids. So whenever you do, excuse me, whenever you do come back to the States, if that's your home country, of course, that you have people who are ready to help you navigate life. Our children,
Yeah.
they were very fortunate to have families in the churches come alongside them and take them to their sporting events, get them involved in their extracurricular activities
Mm,
with them, and then take them to Sunday school class and be their friend. And we also had families who would bring us into their home and go on vacation with us and do things with us that, you know, keep that connection open. Don't just, you know, I don't want to be in the States anymore. I'm just going to go off and do this thing. Don't be a loner. Stay connected
yeah.
and it'll go better. I know we have the advantages of modern communication now with the internet, so that helps a lot. And if you're a person that's not going to the mission field, and if you're going to support a missionary or a missionary, go out of your way to be there for them. Ask them how they're doing. Just because
Yeah.
they're not talking about something doesn't mean they're okay. Be a friend. Let them tell you the truth of what's going on, their struggles. That is so much needed.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. I'm just so thankful that you are willing to talk about these things because there are so many people who feel called to those places of ministry, and it's so important to be surrounded by people who can encourage you, pray for you, be
Yes.
on the front lines with you, in prayer, because you're right. We've got to
Mhm.
count the cost for whatever God is calling us to, and he's always worth it. But I think it's so important to be realistic about what that cost is
Mhm.
sometimes, and just staying
Yeah.
committed to him and knowing that he can use it all for good. He is always on our side. He is always with us. And I'm just so grateful for your story and you just being willing to be transparent about your experiences to help and encourage so many other women and families who are either being called into it or transitioning back to the States and processing their own experiences. So, and you
Mhm.
wrote a book about it as well. So, before we
Yeah.
go, will you please tell everybody where they can connect with you and get your book?
Yes. My book is called I Will Fear No Evil, and it's available on Amazon. And so you should be able to find it by just Googling my name. I don't know if you have a link in the show notes, but it's available on both Kindle and hard copy version. We hope to get an audio version out soon, but that hasn't yet happened. So that is, you can find me on Facebook as well. I do have a support group. It's a private group called Freedom from Anxiety and Depression, where I encourage people who've walked through these
Mm,
struggles or who are walking through these struggles, post a lot of things, thoughts to reflect on, do a lot of one-on-one counseling with people, just as, very unofficial kind of thing, just being there to encourage them. Also, I would say just one more thing about trauma, about hard things. If you're going to the mission field, or even if you're not, I think one thing I've learned, and I wish I had this in place before I went to the mission field, and that is have an action plan for when you face uncertainties. What is your
mm,
plan going to be? And go expecting it. And when it happens, you've got your plan in place.
yeah.
Don't, just because my plan, I didn't have a plan. Whenever I had trauma, I caved. I had panic attacks. I became depressed. I didn't see what the enemy was trying to do. I
Yeah.
was reactionary. And so go with a plan. I think that's a good motto to have in life in general. This is a fallen world, and we are living in a curse. And so bad things are going to happen at some point. And, into every life, difficulties will fall, and we need to be prepared. And I think God can help us with His word, whether it's through music or whatever you come up with as an action plan. Have an action plan and be prepared.
Yeah, I second that absolutely. Well, you guys, absolutely. I will link the book, the Facebook group, all the things for you guys. But Karen, I really am so grateful for your willingness to come and share your story and your experiences and continuing to help so many other women who are going through the same things. Thank you so much for being here with us
You're
today.
welcome. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to tune into another episode of the Byword Show. I love having you here, and I am truly so thankful for your support. Don't forget to share a screenshot of this episode to let me know you were here. And quick favor, if you enjoyed this episode, would you take a second to leave a review? It really helps our community grow. If you want more, you can shop my books Waking Up and Love Is at thehannahhughes.com or on Amazon. And be sure to join my email list for all the latest news. I can't wait to chat again soon, but in the meantime, be sure to come connect with me on social media, and remember, I'm cheering you on.